Good morning. Happy Lord's Day to you. I trust things are well with you and your family. Today we have a great lesson in the book of Daniel, the first chapter. And with all the things that happened, it reminded me of the saying we've heard many times, when the going gets tough and doodah. So the going got tough, and this is how they responded. And hopefully we can be like Daniel in our response to tough going. Dr. Charles Ryrie gave an introduction to the book of Daniel, and he was a scholar at Dallas Theological Seminary and wrote amazing books, taught great classes. He's responsible for writing all the notes and stuff in the Ryrie Study Bible. And if you want a good study Bible, I cannot recommend that any more highly. He said this about Daniel. He said, the prophet Daniel, whose name means God is my judge, was a statesman in the court of heathen monarchs. He was taken captive as a youth, he was about 15, to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC. He spent the rest of his long life there as a governmental official and as a prophet of the true God. He claimed to have written this book in chapter 12, verse 4, and Jesus Christ identified him as a prophet. So I think I'll hang with that. Throughout his life, he was uncompromising and faithful to his God. That'd be a pretty good thing to have on your tombstone, wouldn't it? Throughout whatever your name is, life, he was uncompromising and faithful to his God. What a statement. The timeline on Daniel is that in 627 BC, Jeremiah started his prophetic ministry. Then in 22 years later, Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Egyptians, and Daniel was taken to the Babylonian world in 605. A few years later, in 592 BC, Ezekiel started his prophetic ministry. Then in 586, Nebuchadnezzar came back and took all of Judah, and Jeremiah was taken to Egypt. Then Cyrus of Persia in 538 BC decreed the Israelites to go back to Israel. In 536, Daniel died, so he was about 80. So that was things that were happening during his life. It says in chapter 1, verse 1 of the book of Daniel, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And that's all it says, but that's a hard day. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God in Daniel 1 and 2. Some of your translations, instead of saying Babylon, say it's Shinar. They're synonymous. So when you consider, you remember God's good pleasure in the building and dedication of the temple under Solomon, it seems pretty harsh that some pagan rat could come in and take the temple like that. But because of the way the Israelites had been living, Jeremiah, remember we talked about his ministry started a few years before this event, he had warned Jehoiakim of an impending invasion by Babylon, and they blew him off. And so when Nebuchadnezzar showed up in verse 2 in chapter 1 of Daniel, it says, and the Lord delivered, and look at that, God, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. And these he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylon and put in the treasure house of his God. The word delivered in verse 2 can very easily be translated, and God gave them into his hand, which is amazing. So the Lord gave the Israelites in the hands of some of the most evil people in the world. These are his chosen people, and he allowed that. We saw earlier that these terms, Babylonian and Shinar, are synonymous. And Shinar is a term used for Babylon, and it has a nuanced meaning of a place that is hostile to the true faith. It's associated with Nimrod. You remember him in Genesis 10, and that also became the location of the Tower of Babel when the people were going to rise up to heaven, take God's place. And it's the place where Zechariah prophesies that evil will someday return. It's not a good place. And this is where Daniel and his people were brought. Why did God do this? Well, God had made a covenant with Israel in Moab. You read about that in Deuteronomy 28 and following, just before she entered into the promised land. In this covenant, God set forth the principles by which he dealt with his people. I'm going to do this, you'll do that. All these things were very carefully laid out. He didn't stutter. So their obedience to him would bring blessing. Let me read that. Their obedience to him would bring blessing in Deuteronomy 28, 1-14. But disobedience to him would bring discipline. Now, regarding discipline, in this second portion, God outlined the disciplines that he would use. I mean, if you disobey this is what's going to happen. This isn't new news. He outlined the disciplines he'd use to correct the people when their walk was out of line with his revealed law. These disciplines, now the Lord wasn't just to be punitive. These disciplines would work toward conforming the Israelites to his demands. Why? So they'd be eligible for blessings. He wasn't trying to just hammer them. He wanted them to be in good step with him and to get the blessings that he had promised for them. The ultimate discipline he'd use, and this is very heavy, the ultimate discipline he'd used to correct his people was the invasion by Gentile nations that would subjugate them to the Gentiles' authority and then disperse the Jews from their land. And it was right there in black and white. He said, you mess with me, it's over. And they didn't believe him. Moses stated that when Israel would come under God's discipline, that discipline would not be lifted until they forsook their sin, turned in faith to God, and obeyed his requirements. And he had it laid out in Deuteronomy chapter 31-10. God never changes. You know, we get to thinking, well, it's different. It's not. God never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. If you think he's ignoring the way we're behaving in this country, you need to think again. It is a very ominous thought, but he is not asleep, and he's not some doddering old guy in heaven wondering who hit John. He knows exactly what's going on, and he's not pleased with the general flow of our country, with its immorality, its sin, its ignoring him, and all of the things that go with that. He's not a happy camper. And if we think that that's not going to roll back on us someday if we don't change, if they're in revival, if our country does, it's amazing what's available for in the future. God never changes. Well, you might say, relative to Daniel and the Israelites prior to the invasion by the Babylonians, well, God hadn't done anything yet, so he's not going to do it. Joshua started into the promised land. He took over from Moses, and he started into the promised land around 1400 BC. Nebuchadnezzar rolled into Jerusalem around 605 BC. That's 800 years God put up with their shenanigans. And I'm not saying we got 800 years as a country by any means, but I'm saying God gave them all the rope you could think before they hung themselves. 800 years. He wasn't asleep. He was giving them every chance, but they just threw it back in his face. So up pops Nebuchadnezzar, and God gave them into his hands. Said, here, deal with them. We can always count on God to step up. He's not lax in anything that he does. He loves us, and we're his children, and he's going to deal with us to put us in a position to where we receive his maximum benefit, and that's through obedience, not through rebellion. So with this incursion, now this is a sideline here, but you need to know this because there's a ton of confusion about this. With this incursion by Nebuchadnezzar, an important time period began, which is called the times of the Gentiles. So the times of the Gentiles started in 605 when Nebuchadnezzar rolled into Israel. The times of the Gentiles then is that extended period of time in which the land, which was given in covenant by God to Abraham and his descendants, it starts with Nebuchadnezzar, and the land is occupied by Gentile powers, and the Davidic throne is empty of any rightful heir in the Davidic line. Started Nebuchadnezzar, the Gentiles took over, nobody on the throne. That's when it started in 605 BC, the times of the Gentiles. And so the time we start with Nebuchadnezzar's invasion, 605, is going to continue until the Messiah's return. When the Lord comes back at the end of the tribulation period, the Lord will subdue nations, deliver the land of Israel from its Gentile occupiers, bring the nation of Israel into her covenanted blessings in the millennial kingdom. So that the times of the Gentiles from 605 BC to when Christ comes back and sets up his millennial kingdom. God made a covenant with Israel in Moab, remember in Deuteronomy 38, just before she went into the promised land. He set the principle by which he's going to deal with his people. Their obedience would bring them blessing in Deuteronomy 28. Disobedience would bring discipline, Deuteronomy 28:15. They did not take God at his word, and he gave them away. Remember in the second verse, he gave them away. Why? He gave them away to bring them back. It's a very poignant thing. So here we have Daniel, verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, he's the chief of the court officials. Quickly, he was a eunuch. There isn't any real proof that Daniel and his friends were made eunuchs. Probably not when you get to it. There's been some discussion about it, probably not. But this chief of court officials, Ashpenaz, Nebuchadnezzar said, bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family, from nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. I mean, this is the absolute cream of the crop that he wanted there. And so what was going to happen was this chief official was going to supervise teaching them the language, the literature, the customs, the life of the Babylonians, and brainwashing them into being Babylonian type people that could serve in the court. I mean, they're smart, good, strong, good looking, all that stuff, and they're going to work in the palace there for Nebuchadnezzar, and also having people from the nobility out of Israel. It keeps the people that are left back in Israel in line, because if they blow up the patch, then repercussions land on their people who are in Israel. So a lot of things going on there, but here's Daniel there. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table there in verse 5. They would be trained for 3 years, and after the 3 years, they were entering the king's service. And among these, from Judah, we had Daniel, and then we know them basically as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but we have Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And these were Daniel and his 3 friends. And so the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. To Azariah, Abednego. So Daniel and his friends' names related them and their names to the God of Israel, the true God. These names, Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, filtered back into the gods that the Babylonians worshipped. So Daniel was a young man, good looking, got it going on, was living in the bubble of nobility in Jerusalem, but it popped. They weren't surrounded by the things of God in Jerusalem. They no longer had the influence of their godly parents, for the teachers that were teaching the law and the things of God. So what did they do? What did they do? Now, as we read, these captives were choice young men, physically and mentally, and as such, they'd be a huge asset to the king's palace and to the program he had as far as running his country, doing all the kind of things that he wanted to do. To make this happen, he had to assimilate them into the culture of the court, because he had to learn the language, the literature, and the culture of the Babylonians. So basically, they went to college. When you're that age, you're already a man. This isn't like high school. This was after 12. We'll talk about that in a minute, but then you're looked at as being a man for a lot of reasons. So they're in college, a 3-year course of brainwashing, and then after that, they're going into the king's service. Now, the educational program that probably included a study of agriculture, architecture, astrology, astronomy, law, mathematics, and the Akkadian language, which was the language of the day then. So they had to learn that, which is tough. I watched guys in the doctorate program at Dallas trying to learn Akkadian. It was a long day. Remember, all this was as captives. It wasn't like they were on scholarship. I mean, these were ripped out of their home life, away from their parents, and thrown in as captives in a strange, hostile environment. And here, the education was fine, what they were learning. Moses had to do the same thing in Egypt. He learned all the higher learning of Egypt, and they were smart people. When you look at the pyramids and the way that he learned all that kind of stuff, same thing with Daniel. The education was fine, but not to use too much of a pun, the diet opened a new can of worms. Verse 8, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way, in verse 8. In verse 9, now God, interestingly, intervenes, and he had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, he's just being truthful, he said, I'm afraid of my lord the king. And that was he had right to be, because he would kill him. I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would have my head literally because of you. He'd cut off his head. He didn't care about him. So the problem of whether Daniel and his companions should eat the food provided by the king was a supreme test of their faithfulness to the law. I mean, they just hit the wall right here with this deal about the food. Why? This thing, it probably served also this conflict about the food probably served the practical purpose of separating Daniel and his friends from the other captives. It set them aside as different. And these other captives that came in could apparently compromise in this matter and eat the food. They didn't make any deal about it. Daniel did. His decision, this also, and look at this is interesting, it also demonstrates Daniel's understanding about what had gotten them and Israel into this mess to start with. What was that? God had brought Israel into captivity. Why? Because of their failure to observe the law. They had just blown it off and just gone their own way, and all of a sudden, boop, here we are as prisoners in a hostile land. The way Daniel handled this set the tone for the whole book. It was just staggering what a 15-year-old boy, as we look at him today, young man, did. So here's a question. You think about this for yourself. If you and I have been taken captive, and we've been thrown over into Russia or China when we were 15, into something like this, how would we have handled it? Would we have stood up? Would we have stood tall? Would we have done the right thing? Would we have gone with the flow? Hey, we got great food, great whatever. What would we have done? It's amazing. Hopefully we do the right thing, but even did we know what the right thing was to do? Well, Daniel did. So the question that goes on with this, have we given our children and grandchildren the resources to handle something like this effectively and to stand and to be counted the way they should be? Do they even know what to do? Has this even been brought up at the dinner table? To stand up when it counts and go against the grain? Most people don't want to do that. Most people want to go with the flow and be liked and do that. So it is to us to do the right thing with our children and with our grandchildren, the people with whom we have influence. 3 points from verses 8 and 9. These are great points. It says, then he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself. So he asked, he wanted permission, he didn't want to defile himself. So God caused the official, the Lord's in the middle of this, to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. Daniel's trying to do the right thing, and God backs him up. This is a big deal. So first, Daniel asked permission. It was smart. And the basis for this, and I want you to follow me, and we'll work through this. The basis of this would come from his upbringing. Why is that? Why would his upbringing, what he learned, caused him to ask permission not to do this? What went on? Basically, there wasn't any such thing as a teenager in the Jewish culture. By the time a boy was 12, His dad was supposed to have taught him the moral, civil, and ceremonial aspects of the law. He was supposed to know what God's word was about, know how to apply it. And there were basically three sections: the moral law, the civil deal, and ceremonial. He's supposed to have taught him an occupational skill and set him up for business, ready to start out as a man. So there wasn't any such thing as a teenager. You remember the bar mitzvah, Simon Bar Jonah, son of Jonah, bar mitzvah, son of the law. He was made a son of the law. He became a man, not a teenager. This teenager junk that we go through in our culture today didn't exist back then. It didn't give the kids, young people, a permission to not be mature. So they were. But that meant that the dad had to spend a boatload of time with the young man before he was 12. He didn't start that a month before his 12th birthday. He started it for his whole life, taught him all these things. So Daniel learned about God. He learned about his law. He learned about how God worked with people and worked with situations. So he had a background that generated him asking permission. Let's look at this. Daniel would have been taught the book of Proverbs coming and going as a young man, and the ramifications of it. And he would have known Proverbs 21:1. Proverbs 21:1 says, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, and he directs it like a water course or an irrigation dish wherever he pleases." They have a field that needed water, needed irrigation. They had a main water source, and they had ditches dug all through the field. And so they would put a big board in this ditch, and the water would hit it and run down this part of the field and irrigate it. When that was done, they'd take up the board, stick it in this part of the ditch, and the water would shoot out in another direction, and it would irrigate that part of the field that needed it. And just like that, the king's heart, the guy is in the hands of the Lord, and he directs his heart just like these guys did an irrigation ditch. Boom, boom. He makes it go where he wants it to go, wherever he pleases. A great theme of Daniel that's reflected here as we look at Proverbs 21:1 is that God has everything under control. The COVID, the Spanish flu, the Russia, the China, the elections, he's got it under control. It isn't like he's asleep going, "Oh, look what happened. I'm so mad." That's baloney. He is involved in every aspect of it. And the king's heart's in the hand of Trump, Putin, whoever the guys in China, all these people, the rocket man in North Korea, they're under his control. He's got everything under control. Daniel didn't know whether the chief official would give him permission or not to eat the food. He didn't know that, but he knew that God was in control, and whether he ate the food, the best would happen. His request, God, official, I don't want to eat this food. It's not a good deal. We'll see why in a minute. But you're in charge, Lord, and if it winds up I'm eating the food, bring it. If not, fine. He was completely at rest in God's control of the situation. Proverbs 21:1, as we saw, the king's the one in authority. He's got the king under control. Daniel knew that. He didn't pout. He didn't throw a fit. He didn't whine. He just made the request based on knowing that God's involved in his life. So he put himself in God's hand and he asked in faith. It's a great, great picture to teach your kids, your grandkids, you, me. We need to know this and use it every day. So he courteously, he didn't throw a fit, he didn't pout. He courteously made the request not to eat the food that would defile his conscience. And this was wisdom as far as asking permission beyond most people's years. It takes faith and obedience to overcome the temptations and pressures of the world. You think he wasn't pressured to eat from the king's table, drink that wine, follow the flow that all his other friends were doing? My word, I mean, it was powerful to be part of the herd going down the wrong direction. So it takes faith and obedience to overcome things that come at you every day, things with your friends, things in business, to be upright with your life outside of business. It's a hard day. 1 Corinthians 10:31 speaks to that, and so it says, whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. So you ask yourself in what you do daily, is this for the glory of God? Is this joke I'm telling for the glory of God? Is this demeanor I have? Is this attitude? Is this give to the glory of God? Secondly, he did that because he didn't want to defile himself. Right? What? Didn't want to defile himself. What's that mean? Defile represents a moral or a ceremonial compromise of the Israelite faith. First of all, they were going to have the finest food and drink. They were going to eat this great food and drink from the king's table. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. As one who likes to eat good. However, the Jews generally diluted their wine on a 3-to-1 or 6-to-1 or sometimes 10-to-1 basis, water to wine, the 10 being the water and a little bit the 1 being the wine. They diluted, but the Babylonians didn't dilute the wine, and Daniel and the others risked being drunk, and that's not something that pleases God. So regarding the wine and the food, while there wasn't any complete prohibition against drinking wine in the law, here the problem was, now listen to this, he didn't want to defile himself. Why? The problem was that the wine, as well as the meat, the food, all that stuff, had been dedicated to the idols before they ate it. So this was a big deal. So to eat and drink this food would recognize idols as deities. This saying, hey, I believe this is fine. It's saying with an overt action that these are deities, and by doing that, eating the food, it gives tacit approval of the deities. So what do we learn from that? And basically it's this, is that you and I cannot do things that give the appearance that we approve of sin. If something's wrong, it's wrong. If it's uncomfortable not to do it, so be it. You just do it. We cannot do the things that give the appearance that we approve of sin. So third, God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief official. The word favor comes from the Hebrew word chesed, and it's a powerful word, multifaceted. In this situation, it's used in God's relationship to man. As part of its meaning is God's kindness and goodwill and never-ending favor. When he says it, he always keeps it, goodwill toward men. So compassion, favor, God gave Daniel favor and compassion. Compassion translates a plural term intended to show deep sympathy. When the chief official said, I'm afraid of my lord the king who assigns you your food and drink, he was way serious about that. He said, why should he see you looking worse than the young men of your age? The king would have my head because of you any minute. So it's real clear that in spite of the danger that the chief official incurred, that God intervened on Daniel's behalf in preparing the way for his request. God was right in the middle of it, and he's right in the middle of your life today, whatever you're doing. So even when it's darkest, even when it's the toughest in your life, when things are falling apart, God is intimately, deeply involved with you in what you're doing. He loves you, and he is intimately, deeply involved in what's going on in our country today. And he wants to hear from us. He said, if you'll pray, and if you'll come to me, I'll heal your land. And you want to pray for God to give revival to our country today. Seriously, daily, ask him. He wants to hear from us. So the chief official tested them and said, all right, we'll give a 10-day test on this thing for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youth who ate the king's food. It worked. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink, and then gave them the vegetables, the food that they wanted. And it was more than just broccoli. I mean, it was grown things. I mean, it was a fine diet. It just wasn't the excess that was on the king's table. So God honored Daniel's and his friends' faith. Verse 17 is for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. Among all of them, none of them were found to be like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. The king brought them in to serve him. And every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of the king of Cyrus. He lived to be about 80. Daniel was great. At the end of 3 years, they stood before Nebuchadnezzar for their oral exams. They were far superior to the magicians and enchanters. The statement there, 10 times better, sounds extravagant, but it's an appraisal of their performance, that they were outstandingly different. So Daniel served and died in his 80s. He outlived his captors. And this is a great story of God's power and grace in the darkest of times. How dark it is, he's involved. So here it is. If you have a good foundation, you can stand. If your foundation is faulty, regardless of what your efforts are, you'll fall. And so what's the cornerstone of your foundation? First of all, it's faith and trust in Jesus Christ as your Savior. That is the sine qua non. Without this, nothing. That you've believed Christ died for your sins and rose from the dead, depend on him to be your Savior. Second, in the darkest of times, know that God is with you and he will never leave you. There's Hebrews 13:5. He said, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. And it's an interesting grammatical construction there. Forsake in its totality. When you blow this word up to what it means totally, it means to abandon, desert, leave in straits, leave helpless, leave destitute, leave in the lurch, let one down. He said, I'll never do that to you, never leave you, forsake you. There are three negatives before this word, making this a promise of a triple assurance. He says, when you see these three negatives, Hebrews 13:5, Hebrew, it says, I will not, I will not, I will not, I will never let you down, leave you in the lurch, destitute, leave you in the straits, helpless, abandon you. I'll never leave you nor forsake you. It means that our God will come to our rescue when we find ourselves in difficult circumstances. You think you got it going on tough? He loves you. He cares for you. He's right there in the middle of it with you. Third, God has everything under control. He's going to work it out. God has everything under control. Romans 8:28 says, and we know that God causes everything to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. In total, first, you're one of God's children, eternally untouchable. Second, he'll never, never, never leave you or forsake you. Third, he causes all things to work together for his children. So in that case, when the going gets tough, God's children get going and they keep on going. In every generation, God is looking for those people whom he can use, and he'll get them together. You're not in it by yourself. When I was in high school, I went down to the North Augusta Community Center, and the floor had been cleared for volleyball, and the nets were down, and there was a friend of mine, a little guy, and he was kind of feisty, and they were throwing back and forth like dodgeball, but it worked out to where about 15 people were throwing balls at him, and they thought it was great sport. And I'm not trying to go yay me, it just hit me wrong, so I thought this is not a fair thing, so I got over on his side, and he and I started throwing balls back at the 15. Make a long story short, it wasn't long before there were about 10 people over there with us, and just a few on the other side, and it just died out. I mean, they realized that it was improper, wrong, not a good deal, and nobody did anything about it because the herd was over here, and so I happened to get over there on the others, and it turned out that if you get somewhere where you're in the right, people will follow you. And it was not a big deal for me, but it was a good lesson that when you get involved in the right thing, God will bring people to do with you. Not dodgeball, but in his work. So Daniel and his friends didn't fail, and their testimony has lifted people up everywhere when facing trials and temptations. It's a great lesson. When you're in it up to your neck, remember Daniel and his friends, and God did not leave them, and he lifted them up. When the going gets tough, the tough get going based on their faith in God and being untouchable. Be willing to stand up and to stand out. God will honor it. Amen. Hope you have a great day.
It's a take.